Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of a quick review over the French Revolution lectures that we did, just in case you don't have your notes. We started with this Wordsworth poem, which we discussed the hope that everybody had, or at least a lot of people had, for the French Revolution, and the idea that maybe great things could happen. Obviously, they didn't really know what was coming, but such an exciting time for people who believed in the Enlightenment ideals. Now, France at this time had the three estates. First clergy, second nobility, the third estate really is everybody else. Just remember, these numbers were not particularly equivalent at all. The first estate, the clergy, had less than half of 1% of the population. They didn't pay taxes. They owned an enormous amount, somewhere between 10 and 15% of all the land in France. And people resented them because so many of them were nobles. The local clergy were not nearly as resented. They often were quite poor. But the higher class clergy, who lived just like the rest of the nobles, were pretty well resented by the people. The second estate, which was the nobility, is about 2% of the population, pay, once again, virtually no taxes, own about 30% of the land. Some of them actually have very Enlightenment ideals that they believe in, but a lot of them are very anti-peasant. They think being poor is something pretty shameful. And then that third estate's everybody else. Some rich, many poor, uh, do not own nearly enough of the land to compensate for the vast quantity of taxes that they must pay. The king constantly raises taxes on them. They're restricted from jobs, they're restricted from movement. There's a lot of resentment in the peasantry, especially, but even in that middle class, they are wealthy, they live in towns, but really they're not allowed to do anything. This is the age of absolutism. If you recall, Louis XVI is an absolute monarch in France. Um, France did have an Estates General, but it hadn't met for 200 years almost. And so there's not a lot of representation. The government is pretty much out of money. They spent a lot of money on their own wars, especially the wars of Louis XIV. They have not actually finished paying the debts on those, even though it's been 100 years. And they have spent a lot of money supporting the American Revolution, to be perfectly honest. They don't have a plan to service that debt. They don't have a national bank. And living at Versailles and the expenses of Marie Antoinette are enormous. We do have some wage increases over the last few decades prior to the French Revolution. Wages go up about 22%, but the cost of living goes up about 62%. And then we're going to have a particularly bad harvest in 1788, 89, and basically people just can't afford anything. This is going to make people obviously stressed out, really concerned about how they're going to move forward. Now, the parlements, the local representation of the people, is another problem because while the people didn't love them, they had been one form of representation that was available at least, and these will be abolished. And so people feel like they have no way of complaining to the king. As I mentioned, the American Revolution, not only was it quite expensive, but it had a couple other impacts as well. One, it proved that the philosophes had a point, that you could have sort of an Enlightenment government, that you could rebel against monarchy, that you might have inalienable rights. They saw their ideas put into practice and they worked. And so there's this belief that if the Americans can do it, certainly the French could. It didn't even turn out too badly for England. England thought that this would be an enormous financial disaster for them. And it hurt the United Kingdom for a while, but rather quickly, within a couple of decades, what we see is that the United Kingdom is sending even more goods to the American states at this point in time than they were before. So financially, England comes out pretty okay. Land-wise, obviously, they lose a lot, but they come out pretty okay. And France enjoyed beating England. If you recall, we kind of started way back in the Hundred Years' War, and they've wanted to defeat England all this time, and winning and helping to win the American Revolution certainly was, frankly, fun for people who wanted to defeat them. Now, this is going to kind of come to a head In the summer of 1789, that Estates General that hadn't met, the king is going to have to call that. He has basically hit the end of his resources and he's going to need the Estates General to do some things. But it hasn't met in almost 200 years. And so basically, most of the rules have been forgotten at this point in time, and they're kind of making things up as they go. You do vote by estate, which meant that first estate got a vote, the second estate got a vote, and the third estate got a vote. Well, basically, if the first and second estate are so incredibly wealthy and so much alike, they pretty much always vote the same. And so before the third estate ever even has a chance to say a word, they've lost. Now, they tried to mitigate this by saying that there could be 300 representatives of the first estate, 300 of the second estate, and 600 of the third estate. But since they still only got one vote, that wasn't really a fix. What the third estate wanted was a vote by head. That would give them 600 votes, which was an equivalent amount of votes to the first and second estate, and they really felt like they could probably get just a few votes from the first and second estate and actually achieve a majority. Um, the third estate representatives are mostly upper middle class. Those are the ones who ran for election. Those are the ones who could read, who understood what was going on. These people have read their philosophes. They know the Enlightenment principles. They had brought notebooks of grievances from the peasantry that elected them. And when Louis XVI refused, not really to say they couldn't vote by head, but just to make a decision at all, that's really Louis XVI's big problem, is he never really makes decisions until it's too late. Um, the third estate decides essentially to pull out of the Estates General with a few members of the first and second estate that have been supporting them, very Enlightenment, like the Marquis de Lafayette, people like that. They're going to pull out and form the National Assembly. When the king hears this, he has them locked out of the meeting hall. And then, if you recall, they go across the street and they find an indoor tennis court, and they meet in this tennis court. And they take the tennis court oath, in which they will not dissolve that assembly until they have come up with a constitution. Um, this is not yet to the point of attempting to get rid of the king. They're really looking at the English solution of a constitutional monarch and hoping that they can achieve that. Of course, Louis doesn't like that, who wants to go from being an absolute monarch to a constitutional monarch. And then violence is going to break out and really complicate the whole process. In that summer of 1789, the army had been called in by the king just in case, he said, violence broke out. But anytime you bring a military into a situation, obviously it kind of ramps up the tension. Um, and so we've got the military in Paris. We've got the National Assembly over in the tennis court. We have the sans-culottes. They didn't have sans-culottes without short pants. Remember, they have the working man's pants. And they're very radicalized and kind of forming into gangs in Paris. And they will find that these radicals go and storm the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison in Paris. People would go into the Bastille and never come out again. But more importantly, it was an armory. It held a lot of weapons and gunpowder and things of that nature. They stormed the Bastille. We looked at this part about them dragging the governor of the Bastille out and really crowing in the newspaper about the triumph of liberty, when, of course, what actually happened is they kill him before he gets a trial. And how is that an Enlightenment ideal? How is that justice? But they will bring down the Bastille, not literally, not the walls, but the concept of the Bastille. They'll take the arms out, the weapons out. Really, there's only like 7 or 8 prisoners in there, so they don't get a lot of prisoners out of the Bastille, but it is a sign of what's coming, really. It's going to inspire a bunch of peasant revolts out in the countryside, and really start the summer of the Great Fear, where people are afraid that the food's going to run out. Because remember, we've had a bad harvest. They're afraid that the army is going to come and destroy their towns. They're afraid of pretty much everything. Louis famously says, "Is it a rebellion?" And his advisor says, "Your Majesty, it's a revolution." So he just doesn't get what's happening around him. Out in the countryside, people are burning the houses and the nobles. One, is a sign of protest, but also because all of the documentation that proves that they are stuck where they are, what loans they owe, what rights they have, are in those houses, and they believe if they burn the houses down, then there will be no proof of their servitude anymore. People are attacking houses also because they feel like the nobles are hoarding grain. It really is quite a terrifying summer, and just once again ramps up the violence. Now, back in Paris, the National Assembly, which has changed its name, as you remember, this is going to happen a lot, to the National Constituent Assembly. Constituent basically means uh, brought together to write a constitution. So this is the National Assembly whose purpose is to write the Constitution. And they begin writing that Constitution. It will get rid of those feudal rights, actually, that people are afraid of and burning documents for. Um, and it's Declaration of Rights in Man and the Citizen, it's basically its preamble sort of statement. It is only about 300 words. It's incredibly usable. It's shared all over Europe. It's printed into every major European language. But this whole process took 2 years, and while they're working on that constitution, things are really running out of control in France. We got to a little bit of the National Assembly's reforms that day, but I'll do that in the next lecture, I think.